Hey guys, welcome to another VATSIM tutorial here on the AviationPro channel. In this video we're going to take a look at all the hardware you need and how to set up your home cockpit for flying on VATSIM. Let's go. So guys, setting up your hardware on your home cockpit is more important than you think. It really adds to the comfort of flying when flying on VATSIM. Personally, when I fly, I always try to set up my home cockpit in such a way so that I have to use the mouse in the virtual cockpit as little as possible. Because, it's kind of distracting and sometimes hard to do, especially when you're busy flying the aircraft, when your head is shaking around in the cockpit due to turbulence or due to movements in general by the airplane. So I try to set up my cockpit in such a way so that I can use my hands in the home cockpit to control different functions in the virtual cockpit. Now, of course, it all really depends on your budget, right? I mean, some cockpits look like this and other cockpits look like this. So there's a lot of difference, as you can see. But it doesn't mean if you're on a low budget that you cannot set up your cockpit properly. Actually, even with a low budget, it's perfectly possible to create and design your cockpit in such a way and to configure all your buttons and things like that in such a way as to make flying on VATSIM as comfortably as possible. So let's take a look at a cockpit setup with the bare minimum you really need for flying on VATSIM. So for starters, of course, you need a PC and you probably already built one by now, and I kind of assume you already did. But in general, it's very important that your flight simulator runs as smoothly as possible on your system because that will really enhance the flying experience. And the lagginess and the stutters can be a real distraction when flying on VATSIM. So make sure you build or purchase a system that is able to run your simulator well and its associated add-ons, because especially those add-ons can be pretty heavy on the system. So just make sure that it runs smoothly, because it will really help your life on VATSIM. So this is a basic idea of what a home cockpit on a budget could look like. Alright, so we'll just take a look around what it consists of, and then we'll go through the items one by one. And of course, again, it depends on your budget, how much of this you'll be able to afford, but I think some items are really bare minimums that are required for flying on VATSIM. So first of all, of course, you need a good monitor, and a monitor will be able to allow you to see well in the virtual environment, to see your instruments and the runway at the same time, for example, and just to make sure that everything is readable for you. Okay, so I've got a nice widescreen monitor, and it helps a lot. And then, of course, try to get a set of speakers if you can, so that all the flight sim sounds run through your speakers, and then you can let all the air traffic control sounds run through your headset. Now, this is the headset that I've got. It's a simple Logitech USB headset, and it works very well. So I can just play, using the VPilot settings, I can play the ATC audio through this headset, and it has volume buttons and a mic mute button, so I can always adjust the volume of the air traffic control separately while flying on VATSIM. So make sure you give it some thought. Of course, you can also just use one headset, but in that case, it will be harder to control the volume of the ATC and the flight sim separately.
So guys, I would like to demonstrate a little bit why it's so important to configure your headphone correctly. Now, it depends a little bit on which headphones you have or which headset. Each sound a little bit different, each is designed in a little bit of a different way. But in a headset like this, where you don't have this pop filter on, this furry thing, generally is designed to not have the microphone directly in front of your mouth, because otherwise you're gonna hear very loud noises. So it's kind of next to my cheek. It's not directly in front of the airflow of my mouth. But I hear a lot of pilots on the VATSIM network who start to talk like this, and then with every breath and with every word, it sounds very bad, and you don't want this to happen, okay? So, take good care, make sure you know which type of microphone you have, make sure you just record yourself using the Windows voice recorder, whatever, just to make sure you know how you sound over the VATSIM radios. Now, the thing you want to try to achieve is not to sound too loud like I just demonstrated, but also not too soft, so you don't want to sound like this, okay? Try just to keep your level normal. So, for example, a good way to test that is by looking at the actual decibels if you can, maybe using a video editor, or maybe just play a YouTube video at normal volume and then play your audio recording at normal volume and see if that is correct. You know, generally YouTube videos which are created by good creators have good audio levels, okay? So you can kind of compare, okay, is my audio level similar, or is it really, really low, or is it really, really high, okay? So that might be a good way to check that out.
Now over to the joystick. Now, trust me, you cannot fly on VATSIM using a keyboard. You really need a joystick for that, because something simple as flying a pattern and traffic pattern around a runway, VATSIM controllers expect you to be able to do that, and you cannot do that accurately with a keyboard. So just get a joystick. This is the Logitech Extreme 3D Pro joystick, and you can configure any button you want, and it works just fine. It's a great joystick with a lot of configurable buttons, and it's pretty cheap. You might want to check out my review, to which there's a link in the description. Also very important is the push to talk key, and I've set that right here. This is the key. And basically what this allows me to do, I'm able to control the aircraft, so steer the aircraft in the air, and I just can push my thumb to talk to the air traffic control radio. So I don't have to use a separate button on a keyboard or whatever. I can push the talk button while flying. That's really, really helpful, okay? So make sure you set the push to talk button on your joystick if you can. Another useful tip that I'd like to give, if you happen to have an old and dirty keyboard like this one lying around in the house, then you might be able to use that keyboard to put on labels, so you can use that as an instrument to control functions in the cockpit. So I've labeled this keyboard, and it allows me to control things like the navigation display, a lot of EFIS functions, adjusting the range of the navigation display, showing airports and things like that. But you can also design it in such a way so that you, for example, use a lot of autopilot or motor control panel controls on this keyboard, so that you can adjust the heading with the touch of a key on your keyboard, so you don't have to switch views in the flight sim and use your mouse in the virtual cockpit during turbulence or whatever to adjust the autopilot. And a lot of flight simulation add-ons come with some way of setting keys for cockpit functions. For example, in the PMDG, you can just open up the FMC and select keys for various functions in your simulator. Another very important aspect of flying on VATSIM is charts, and you want to make sure that you have some way of viewing them. So if you happen to have a tablet, you can just upload them to Dropbox, for example, and use the Dropbox app to view all the charts. And otherwise, just print the charts and the checklist, okay? So that you have them next to you when flying. And charts are really important. We're going to explore them in the next video. But just to make sure that you have some way of viewing them, whether that be on a tablet or in paper format. And then some general comments. Just make sure that your cockpit is designed in such a way so that you sit comfortably. So also make sure that you get a comfortable chair, and that you just try to design it in such a way so that it feels like a real cockpit, so that you don't have to move too much to control functions in the cockpit. Know that you can just use, with the stretch of an arm, you can basically control most of the functions in your home cockpit. And of course, that's a lot of fun. And also make sure you have a piece of paper next to you. That's really, really helpful when flying on VATSIM. So I hope that was helpful, so that you have some tips and tricks to design your home cockpit as efficiently and comfortably for flying on VATSIM as possible. So we're now going to take a look at how I've set up my home cockpit, which is a little bit more advanced. I've added a little bit more hardware to it, and I'm just going to show you around, and maybe you can learn something from it. And of course, it really depends on your budget again, but as you progress in your flight simulation career, you're probably going to be buying some extra hardware to make your flying even more realistic. So let's take a look. So welcome into my home cockpit. As you can see, I've still used the same screen and the same speakers, but I'll just give you a bit of an overview of what my home cockpit setup looks like, and we'll go through the different items. And as you can already see, it's more advanced than the other cockpit layout that I just showed you, but this really makes my flights on VATSIM really pleasurable, really nice and realistic, and allows me to control a lot of functions from my home cockpit instead of doing it from the simulator. So let's take a look at the items. We start off on the left with the joystick. I'm not using it as a flight control stick, I'm using it as a steering tiller. So that's the thing that controls the nose gear. I can still use it as a controller, but only if I'm flying with two pilots. And on the side I have the same push to talk key that I just showed you, so I can also talk to ATC when taxiing. Then of course I have the iPad again to view the charts, and nothing has changed there basically. And then here we have the ProFlight yoke system. I think a very well-known hardware product for flight simulation. A good yoke with a lot of buttons, and it comes with a throttle, and it's just, yeah, it's cheap and it works very well for flight simulation. There's a head switch to look around in the cockpit. Works pretty good. And then we have a lot of other buttons that you can configure yourself, for example trim down and trim up. And then on the back here on the left, the same principles applies as with the joystick. You want to be able to talk to ATC while flying and steering the aircraft, so I can press this push to talk button. So the way I configure this is using FSU-IPC, a great module to configure all your hardware. Now what this does is when I push a button on the joystick, it will code for a key on the keyboard, in this case the scroll lock key. And when I tick the box to repeat it while holding, then it continuously sends out the scroll lock button. And I've set the scroll lock button in VPilot as a push to talk key. So I can use either of the joysticks to press the button and transmit on the radios, and it's very useful. So the rest of the joystick or the yoke, as you can see, here's the autopilot disconnect, and there's some other buttons left which I didn't configure, but of course you can configure any buttons that you want. But in general I really like flying with this yoke, especially as I'm a Boeing man. And at the bottom I have a set of rudder pedals, which of course absolutely required when you're flying airplanes to control the rudder, which is great for crosswind landings, and yeah, just a great thing to do and to use, and also relatively cheap. Then we have my throttle set. As you can see, I have 2 throttle quadrants by SciTech, and I've kind of configured my own throttles and kind of created shapes out of styrofoam to control both engines, control the speed brake, to have an axis for the reversers, and also have an axis for the flaps. And again, this is all configured using FSU-IPC. And yeah, I think you really need that module if you really want to have a more advanced hardware setup to allow things like this to happen. Then of course it comes with a lot of buttons, which is great. So for example, the TOGA button is this one. Then I have the parking brake set and release. Then if I move the throttles up, there we have some buttons to configure the throttle synchronization and the autothrottle disconnect. We have the fuel control switches to start and shut down the engines. And then over here I've got some more buttons for throttle syncing. And over here I've got the transponder mode switch, so I can easily, when vacating runway for example, move the transponder to standby mode. Right here I've got my CP flight MCP. Don't worry about the flickering displays, that's just because I'm recording at 60 frames per second. This is quite an expensive set of hardware, but I got it secondhand, so that made it a lot cheaper. And it allows me to control all the functions of the mode control panel in the Boeing aircraft, and it's really helpful, especially when flying on VATSIM. You make quite a lot of use out of the autopilot, and being able to use your hands actually in your home cockpit to control these functions is just great, especially when you get vectors, for example. So you can just put in that data and press all those buttons manually. It's quite awesome. And then over here I still use the keyboard. I used to use it a lot for the mode control panel functions, but since I have the CP Flight 1, I'm now using it mainly for EFIS functions, so the navigation display stuff that you will find in most airliners. So yeah, still pretty useful, that old keyboard. And behind me on the ground I've got an extra set of speakers which function as rear speakers, so that's really awesome when you spool up the engines and really adds to the immersion of the sounds in the home cockpit. So guys, I hope that was helpful, and that maybe you will have now some more inspiration to design your home cockpit, to have as smooth as possible VATSIM flight as possible. So now that we have set up all the software and the hardware basically for flying on VATSIM, in the next video we're really gonna start at looking at how to make an actual VATSIM flight. So in the next video we're going to take a look at how to find and read charts. Aviation charts are very important. You cannot fly without them. They're very easy to find actually. A lot of people just don't take the effort to find them, but they are really essential to have them next to you when you're flying. So that will be in the next video. So guys, thanks for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe to the AviationPro channel to get to know about any latest VATSIM videos, and also make sure that you leave any questions or comments below so that I can answer them for you. So make sure you check out some of my other VATSIM videos and make sure you subscribe and like, and your contribution is very much appreciated. If you want to support the AviationPro channel, make sure you check out the description to see how you can do that. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one.